All right, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Connie Bolin. I'm the founder and coordinator for Warbirds in Review. With all these people that do a great job behind me here, I really don't have to do very much, but there are a lot of hours that go into making Warbirds in Review what it is, and it wouldn't be anything if we didn't have such a great audience to come see them. So thank you for being here. And we wouldn't have the ability to have this type of production if it weren't for the Scott's Miracle-Gro Company and my good friend Jim Hagedorn and the Scott's Miracle-Gro Company. They have been our sustaining sponsor for several years now, and they allow us to bring you the Sleeping Dog Productions team and present the videos, the Jumbotron, the seating. All of that comes from the Warbirds in Review Fund, that we are very appreciative of Scott's Miracle-Gro. And I'll take just a moment to make a personal note here. I don't run around in a flight suit acting like I'm a pilot. You know, somebody said, oh, they gave that girl a flight suit. Yeah, they gave the girl a flight suit. And I got Jim Hagedorn's P-51 this morning to bring it back from Waukesha, where we had moved it for the bad weather yesterday, made it back in time to introduce this program and welcome all you here. So that's why I'm in the flight suit. So I've had a good time this morning, and I know you'll enjoy these beautiful airplanes that are here behind us. Also, speaking of behind us, we have the beautiful Quonset hut that is our production room, green room production. It's really fascinating to see what they do to make this happen. But that is behind me here, and in just a few minutes, and that is provided by Ron and Diane Fagan, Fagan Fighters World War II Museum, Granite Falls, Minnesota. Worth the trip off the beaten path to go see their museum. It's amazing. Today our moderator is going to be Sam Bass, and he's going to talk with a couple of guys who are closely associated, I guess is an understatement, with the Dakota Territory Air Museum that provide these beautiful airplanes. We have an introductory video that gives you a little bit of the history of these airplanes and what our allies meant to us in World War II and continue to mean to us. And thank you to those guys for being here and for the preservation of these beautiful airplanes. If you'll direct your attention to the Jumbotron, we'll have the video. Thank you.
An jedem Tag nur zu denken an Deutschland, an Volk und an Reich, an unsere deutsche Nation. Unser deutsches Volk Sieg! Sieg! Sieg!
Adolf Hitler, the Führer, dictator of Nazi Germany, along with Mao and Stalin, one of the most evil killer leaders of the 20th century. Over 6 years, Hitler built an overwhelmingly powerful and tactically brilliant military force, ground, sea, and air. He took over Austria and Czechoslovakia, then in 1939 invaded Poland. Within 3 months, he crushed 6 countries, controlled most of Western Europe, and was knocking on France's door. In the spring of 1940, the Germans surrounded nearly 340,000, mostly British and French, troops. Their only escape was from the shore of the port of Dunkirk in northwestern France. The water was extremely shallow, so British destroyers could not approach the beaches without running aground. Well, Prime Minister Winston Churchill mobilized every possible private boat, over 700 of them, to cross the English Channel from Ramsgate in eastern Britain to the rescue, and saved more than 338,000 British and French troops to fight another day. And that day came very soon, when the Germans began what became known as the Blitz, nearly 10 months of bombing Britain day and night, the Battle of Britain,
The RAF met this challenge with some of the best fighter aircraft in the world, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. In the opening days of battle, Britain was in immediate need of two things: a collective stiff upper lip and aluminum. A plea was made by the government to turn in all available aluminum to the Ministry of Aircraft Production. "We will turn your pots and pans into Spitfires and Hurricanes," the ministry declared, and they did. Both these iconic aircraft, in spite of their differences, both in origin and in performance, the two fighters became counterparts. Together, they turned the tide of history's first great air battle. A question that has been asked by pilots, historians, and air enthusiasts since 1940 and still persists today: which is better, the Supermarine Spitfire or the Hawker Hurricane? Wing Commander Robert Stanford Tuck said the Spitfire was like a fine thoroughbred racehorse, while the dear old Hurricane was rather like a heavy workhorse. After many years of reflection, said a former Spitfire pilot during the 1980s, "I take the view that it took both of them to win the Battle of Britain, and neither would have achieved it on its own."
Good morning, folks. Welcome to the 2020-21 Warbirds in Review. We would like to welcome you here.
You guys got your
And this is very unique
We didn't get time to put names on
opportunity here to see the two airplanes that won the Battle of Britain. We have Warren Pietsch here. We also have Ray Middleton and Bernie Vasquez. And the owner of the museum that owns these airplanes, amongst others, is Bruce Eames. Now, Bruce, if you would have a seat here, and you, Warren, and you go over on the other side, I'd appreciate it. Over here. We also have Chuck Craven. Chuck, there he is. He's the historian. He will be helping us out in our little interview here. Now, first of all, Warren is a pilot presenter for today, and he's the Vice President of Operations for the museum. He has a 20-year captain for a major airline, 35,000 hours, honorable Canadian snowbird, aerobatic competency evaluator for ICAS, owner of Pietsch, Minot, North Dakota. I can't say that word.
Why not? Why not?
Minot. I
Yeah,
can
we're
say
not
that.
French.
I can almost say that.
Why not? Why not?
And also, he's qualified in too many airplanes for you to list here, so I won't do that. And this is the owner of the museum, and Bruce has quite a collection of airplanes in his museums there. I'll just go through a little few here. These are just the Warbirds. C-53 Sky Trooper, Mark 9 Spitfire, P-51 C and D. Do you also have an A?
No.
Just C and D?
Yeah.
Mark 4 Harvard, P-40, F-8 Bearcat, Hurricane, F-2 M2 Wildcat, L-5, P-47 Thunderbolt, and numerous other aircraft. I understand it was how many square feet do you have in your museum?
Yeah.
Well, the museum has 55,000 square feet of indoor displays and 17 acres of outdoor displays. We actually started the Dakota Territory Air Museum in 1986, and we've been building it ever since. And Bruce is a big part with the Warbird end of things. We have a deal worked out with him where he lends us the airplanes, and we use them to promote the museum. We have about 60 airplanes in the museum total, and Bruce has about a dozen there, with the ones you just listed, obviously. So.
Well, what motivates you to start the museum to start off with?
Well, I don't own the museum. I'm a big sponsor of it, as Warren indicated. But I'm probably like a lot of people here that I'm at the age group where I and all my friends growing up, our fathers had been in World War II. So we grew up building the models, hearing the stories, and really getting inspired by it and intrigued by it. And so the rest of my life was going to air shows just like this. And I was fortunate enough that at some point in my life that my business was successful enough that I could start doing something to add to this and help keep these planes alive and share them with people and so on. That's really was the motivation.
That's an understatement.
Well, it's very well put. Just talk about the Spitfire to start off with. First of all, when was it developed? When did they first start flying the Spitfire?
Well, 1936, I believe, was the first flight of the Spitfire, and it was obviously a different airplane than this, and I'm sure a lot of you know that probably more about the history than I do, but the first one came out with a tail skid and a two-bladed wooden propeller that was fixed. So you can see the progression through the years of them. They built over 20,000 Spitfires of different marks. And it was a year behind the Hurricane. The Hurricane was designed and built in 1935 originally, I believe, and we have a British gentleman here who was involved in restoring this airplane and helping us keep this airplane going, Ray Middleton, and he knows that history very well because these airplanes are extremely important to England. They're important to us also, but this is an iconic airplane for them, as is the Hurricane, and it's as you saw in the video, the lead-in video, as the war was gearing up, it was pretty obvious that something was coming, and people were trying to develop airplanes as fast as they could and get things going. And so Spitfire, to answer the question, about 1936 and built throughout the war. The Hurricane in 35 and built throughout the war.
So you said there were 20,000 of them that were built?
Yeah.
And how many do you think are still able to fly? Different ones.
We were discussing this the other day. We think 40 or 50 Spitfires left flying and maybe 13 Hurricanes.
Okay, just for reference here, what was the original horsepower for the original two-bladed prop?
Ray, you know what the original horsepower was?
Under 1,000, around about 1,000 horsepower.
Now, what was it at the end of the marks?
Well, with the Griffin engine, around 2,200.
How much?
2,250.
Big difference, right?
Yeah. Quite a development. The tails got bigger.
Right.
Everything, it became a real challenge. And I believe the Griffin Spitfire has a limited power that it can be used on takeoff because they can't control the airplane during the takeoff roll. They have to wait until they're actually airborne and at a certain speed before they can open it up.
Well, what kind of range did it have?
None.
None? So
they're interceptors. I mean, they went up and down.
That was it.
That's probably one of the major differences in the mentality of building the airplanes, I think, is what they were doing with them. They were on an island and the channel was small, and this airplane carries 94 Imperial, 116 U.S. gallons. So hour and 50 minutes, it's out of gas. And this one originally had a very similar amount of fuel. This one has been modified a little bit, which makes it a very nice cross-country airplane, but it doesn't have any room for ammo anymore because of the gas. But you know what? I would say that they were 50-minute airplanes, 50 minutes to an hour, especially in a fight when they had the power open.
So they'd fly maybe two or three missions a day, right?
Oh, I think during the Battle of Britain, they probably flew 10.
10 missions.
Yeah, so if they survived that long.
What kind of armor did they have on the Battle of Britain?
The Spitfire had a lot of different options in the wing. This particular airplane has two 20-millimeter cannons and four 303 machine guns in it. The Hurricane has, as you can see, there's 6 aside, so 12 303s in it. But they modified the airplanes throughout the year for different roles for tank busting, and they mounted cannon on them and stuff. The wing on this Spitfire is called a universal wing or a C wing, and it could be changed out to have 4 20-millimeter cannon, or it could have 50 calibers in it, or all 303s.
Well, did they have different armor during the Battle of Britain, or did they all have machine guns? Or what
Well, Battle of Britain and Mark 9 wasn't out yet. So
yeah, right.
It would have been what Mark 5 would have been, Ray?
Yeah, up to the 5, yes.
Yeah, and so were they all 303s, or they had cannon on the Mark 5 too, didn't they?
I think it was after the Battle of Britain.
It was after the Battle of Britain. Okay, so it was probably all 303s.
Well, how about the Hurricane?
Same thing.
Same thing?
Yeah. Which when you look at the amount of guns in the Hurricane, it obviously had a little more firepower if you were using the small machine gun.
So tell us about it. Go through a typical mission that they would have during the Battle of Britain.
Well, I think during the actual battle, they laid next to the airplanes, and the airplanes were ready to launch. If I was going to tell about a typical mission, I love to tell a story about a guy that we met from the RCAF that went over and flew with the English, and he was there shortly after the Battle of Britain. But they would sit on alert in the airplanes, warmed up with them shut off in the airplane, And when he said they were on a coastal town, and FW-190s would come across without drop tanks, and they'd have 2 500-pound bombs on them, and they would bomb the coastal towns because that's as far as they could get before they had to turn around and go back. And they built the Mark 9 to chase the later model 190s, but at this time he was in a Mark 5, and he said it wouldn't quite keep up with the 190. So he and his wingmen are sitting on the ground waiting, and they call and say there's 2 190s coming in. So they scramble off and catch the 190s as they're about ready to drop their bombs. So the 190s dropped the bombs, and the wingman shot down the 190 wingman, and Barry Needham started chasing the other guy across the channel. And he said I had it wide open, war emergency power, and he was starting to get away from me a little bit, and I didn't have enough gas to turn around and go back if I went any further. So at that time, he said, I just kind of pulled the nose up and squeezed the trigger on the 20s, and I saw a puff of smoke come off the 190, but I had to leave. So he turned around and went back, and he said, I wrote up my report and said I claimed damage to a 190. Well, that entire episode took 20 minutes, and he was out of gas when he got back, but he was wide open throttle the whole time, so he used everything he had. Years later, he was in contact with somebody. Ends up that the guy that he hit, he shot him down. He didn't know it until 1970, and somebody called him and said, hey, we found out that you actually shot the guy down. You can add him to your kill list. And the guy lived, but he was killed on the Eastern Front in Russia later on, but his brother's alive. So they got together, and his brother was running a hostel in Austria, and they ended up meeting each other in the 90s. And Barry said he walked into this hostel, and the guy said, just a minute, I have something for you. And he ran upstairs, and he came down with a plaque with a 20-millimeter bullet on it and said, you gave this to my brother. I'm giving it back to you. Anyway, that's kind of a description, I think, of how they operated the airplanes.
Well, now, you fly this airplane. You also fly the Hurricane, and, man, you fly both of them also, right? But is that the only 2 people that fly both airplanes?
Well, this is Bernie Vasquez. He's our director of maintenance, but he also flies all of our airplanes with the Dakota Territory Air Museum. He's been with the group now for 9 years, something like 10 years.
Something like that.
Yeah. He's a young guy, but he's a pretty talented individual, so I couldn't get this done without him. And it really helps to have your director of maintenance be talented in all the airplanes, because when there's something wrong, you can say, go fly it, figure out what's wrong, and fix it. So he flies all the airplanes that we have in the museum, and he's qualified to do air shows in both airplanes, so he's got quite a bit of experience in both.
Well, Warren, are you 2 guys the only 2 people around that fly both airplanes? I fly both types of airplanes.
No, I'm sure that the museum, the Eamans Museum, has guys that are flying both airplanes and stuff.
And I'm pretty sure Hinton,
exactly.
Steve flies both and can fly both.
Well, in any event, compare this airplane versus that airplane. I'm
extremely surprised.
You heard that 1,000 times.
And it's really interesting to talk about. I mean, I'm really happy to be here, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to come and listen to this stuff. But Ray built the Hurricane originally. He restored it. It was recovered in 1971 from a swamp in Newfoundland, by Gander, Newfoundland, where it had crashed in 1944 with an engine failure. The pilot survived that ditch and walked out of it, and Ray was involved in the original rebuild and this last one also, and he just finished it about a month ago, so we picked it up. And honestly, I read a lot of books about the Battle of Britain. I'm extremely interested in it. Was anxious to fly it, but didn't expect a lot out of the airplane. I thought, well, everybody kind of downplays a Hurricane. The Spitfire, as one of Ray's friends, Gary, said, the Spitfire was the prom queen and this was the 4-H queen. And it was, so I didn't really expect a whole lot out of the airplane. And when I flew it the first time, I was very pleasantly surprised. Yes, the Spitfire is a little more nimble. It's a little bit faster. But the Hurricane is very close, and it's robust, and it's a nice flying airplane, and performs remarkably well.
But now both these airplanes were created within a few years of each other, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about the structure, or tell us about the structure of this particular airplane. Why that they have the fabric on it?
Yeah. There's the guy that built it.
There's a guy that built it.
He can talk to you about enclosed streamlined flying wires. I don't understand them.
And that's Ray Middleton, by the way.
Back in the day, when they were getting ready to build monoplex fighters,
Ray, hold it a little closer.
Hold the mic close to your mouth.
Okay, how's that?
There you go.
Yeah.
So back in the day, in the early 30s, when they were trying to build monoplane fighters, the methodology that Hawkers had hailed from the day of World War I and the 1920s, biplanes and flying wires and fabric. And the obvious for the designer of this airplane was Sidney Cam, who incidentally also designed the Hawker Hunter, which is quite a contrast. He was also responsible for a lot of their biplanes. But I think they just took the methodology back then, which was steel tubes braced with streamlined wires and to keep the box section straight. And then they clipped on wooden formers and covered them with fabric. So it was an obvious transference to this, to use the systems they had. And indeed, the early Hurricanes had fabric wings also. If you look at the little tail wheel on this, it's the identical tail wheel that was used on some of the Hawker biplanes. So it's just a case of using what they had to get this thing in the air. Does that answer it?
That's some of it.
Pretty much.
I think, I'd like to add a little bit to, Ray, he and his team did a beautiful job of restoring the airplane. And later on, we'll probably unfasten a panel, but if you look behind the cockpit, you'll see panels that are actually constructed of wood with fasteners, quick detached fasteners and fabric, so you can get in and work on it. And they're, that thick and lightweight, very lightweight, and probably very easily repairable during the war. They could change that stuff out. You said that some of the airplanes even flew with one metal wing and one fabric wing, so they were just a different type of construction. Any other people from England in here? Any other British people? So I just one guy up there.
Right
so I have two people to pick on, you and Ray. You can look at the airplane and see that it doesn't look extremely streamlined. It doesn't have a retractable tail wheel, neither does the Spitfire. It does, however, have a retractable step to get in and out of the airplane. I don't understand that whole theory. And there's things that
Hawker did that throughout all of their World War II production, and I was told, I used to work in a shop that rebuilt Sea Furies, and I was told it was all back cavalry. That was how you got on a horse. That was how you got on your airplane.
And it's shaped like a stirrup. That's exactly what it looks like.
And same with the rudder pedals. They have leather stirrups inside.
Yeah.
So I guess when you're fighting in big boots, you can move the rudder pedal around.
So it's got that. There's the gear and flap retraction system in this airplane looks like a Hurst shifter. It's got a neutral, and it's got a select switch, and then you can put the gear up, or you can come back and put the gear down, or you can go back to neutral when you're done, and you can put the flaps down, or you can put the flaps up, all conveniently located in one place on the other side of the cockpit from the throttle. So you have to switch hands as you're taking off and doing things, and you're moving stuff around. It's just a different way of building an airplane, and it's an antique. It's an old airplane, and it had old ways of doing things. They hadn't. The P-51's like flying a modern airplane when you fly it. Everything's in a nice place.
And that was not to pick on the British, but if the Americans figured out you could do it with one bolt, one washer, one nut. The British, 3 bolts, 6 washers, 3 nuts, and then they staked the nuts so that when the poor guy tried to take them off next time, he had to use some kind of crowbar.
How much weight savings do you think was saved by using this fabric? You have any idea? How about it, Ray?
I don't think there was any real saving in weight.
With a British accent, you could say anything and we'll believe it.
Yeah. It was nothing to do with weight saving. It was just the technology they had.
Although, wouldn't you say the Hurricane's pretty light? You said it's 5,800 pounds.
It is. It's 5,800 pounds.
And when you watch the airplane take off, it's amazing how fast it gets in the air compared to this airplane. Well, it's got a fat wing, yeah, but it's also pretty light. It accelerates good and everything, and I think it's probably 600 or 800 pounds lighter than the Spitfire. So,
well, was there any? I had read that there was an advantage to that was that the fabric construction was it could be repaired very easily during the Battle of Britain. They could ride a sortie and come down and stick a patch on it, and then go right back up.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, as long as it hadn't hit anything structurally, you just slap a fabric patch on it.
Okay.
And that would be it.
Well, tell me about what's the difference of this particular paint job on this airplane. And we'll talk about this one in a little bit.
So this Spitfire was built at Castle Bromwich in March of 1944. It flew 74 missions in World War II. It flew with the Polish volunteers, 302nd and 303rd, and then it was transferred to the Free French. This paint job is as it was flown by a French airman that was still alive while Rayburn Thompson was rebuilding the airplane, and the guy actually painted a painting of it after the war, and Rayburn used that for the paint scheme on this airplane. It flew over the beaches of Normandy on D-Day plus 7 or 9, I can't remember which one, D-Day plus 9 I think it was. So extremely significant airframe. It went on to be used through the end of the war and then transferred to the Dutch Air Force, and it was a gate guard at an officers club in the Netherlands when Rayburn recovered it and brought it back to the United States and rebuilt the airplane. And he did. I wish Rayburn was still around. I never had a chance to meet him, but flying his airplane, he was obviously a craftsman. He did a very nice job of building an airplane. So that's a historic airplane. This airplane was built by Canadian Car and Foundry in 1942. The Canadians built, I think, about 470 of the. How many Hurricanes did you say were built? 14,000?
14,000 and some.
Yeah, so the Canadians built, 470 or 500, and then this airplane was on coastal patrol in Newfoundland when it was put into the swamp due to an engine failure.
Well, how many Hurricanes do you think are still flying? Ray, you know that, would you?
I think this is the 13th.
Are there any more
It's
being
either
restored?
the 13th or the 14th. I'm not 100% sure, but it's about that number.
Is any more being restored that you know of?
I know of 2 more that are being restored.
That's good. Okay. All right. Well, now let's talk about the paint job on this and the LC Wade.
Me again?
Whoever.
You want to go on this?
Well, let me just make a point about mentioning LC Wade as a pilot who this paint job is reflecting. Is getting back to this idea of why we're even doing this is that the planes are one thing, but I think the thing that's even more important are the guys that flew these. And again, it's like all you guys that had fathers and grandparents and stuff that were involved in this stuff, their stories are what bring these planes alive. And that's what we really like focusing on at DTAM. And the LC Wade story with this plane is phenomenal, as Warren will go on to tell.
Well, you can do it. I mean,
No.
Wildcat Wade. Chuck Gravens is sitting here along with Ray and Bernie, and Chuck has done a tremendous amount of research on these airplanes and put together some really good stuff. When the airplane was originally restored, it was with a Texas museum, and they decided to use the LC Wade paint scheme and story because of this tremendous story of him. They called him Wildcat Wade. He was LC Wade. He never was given any Christian names, but he enlisted in the RAF before he enlisted in June of 41.
Now, you mentioned that he's an American.
Yes, he was from Texas, and he was a mule skinner from Texas, and he went out, he bought his own airplane, he learned how to fly, he built time in it so he would qualify. He went to San Francisco and enlisted and was scurried off over to England where he finished his training for flying these, and he ended up going to Malta and North Africa. This airplane is painted in the scheme of the airplane he was flying in North Africa. He went into action in September of 41, and by December 5th of 41, 2 days before Pearl Harbor, he had shot down 5 airplanes. But on the 5th airplane, he was damaged from debris, and he had to put the airplane in the desert. His co-pilot landed his wingman landed his airplane alongside him in the desert to try to get him out of there, but broke his airplane in the process. So the 2 of them walked back, and on December 7th got back to their base, entering the
Late Arrival Club.
The Late Arrival Club, yeah. That was, so, on the day that he got back from walking out of the desert after it becoming an ace, America joined the war with Pearl Harbor.
Well, it took him a couple of, 2 days to get out? What, 25 miles
Yeah.
or something?
Yep,
In
exactly.
the North African desert?
Yeah.
How did they survive?
They ended up, they located where they were, and they dropped supplies to them to keep them alive for the walk back.
Yeah, because she wouldn't be able to survive, yeah.
They did pick them up the next day. And
Yeah.
All right.
And, they located them, dropped supplies, and then they still had to sneak through German camps at night.
Yeah.
And then they picked them up with a can't remember, but anyway, one of the twin utility airplanes.
Well, and at that time, things are really hot for them because the war in North Africa at the time, it was a back and forth battle. In fact, from September of 41 to October of 42, they had to move their base backwards and forwards something like 18 times. And so they were really hopping. It was hot. Yeah.
Before we go any further, tell us the story about L.C. Wade and why he was ignored all these years.
Well, I don't, I think ignored is a little strong, maybe forgotten.
Or not
somebody
maybe not recognized.
He's an ace without a country, right, Chuck?
Yeah.
Isn't that what?
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
And I think it has a little bit to do with how he died. It was an accident, and that doesn't make great press for war propaganda. So they actually did some cover-up. I can get into that later. And he wasn't an American, so the Americans weren't, producing. But he had 23 kills for certain when he died, and possibly 25. Well, 25 would put him 10th on the all-time aces list of American aces, and 23, I think, would tie him with 14th, but yeah, at least in that neighborhood. And not too many people know him. If you say L.C. Wade, who,
Yeah.
And he was the highest scoring American ace in a foreign service, right?
Well, not only that, he was the highest scoring ace in the Mediterranean and Desert Theater when he died in the RAF.
Well, and the other interesting thing about it is, too, which probably contributed to it, is that when the Eagle Squadron were started, he considered joining an Eagle Squadron, but ultimately decided, I've been fighting with my mates in the RAF, I'm sticking with that. So he was with the RAF till his demise.
When was he killed?
He was killed in Italy.
When?
One of the Foggia complex bases, I think, I don't remember, it was number 7 or whatever, but he had, by the time, this was January of 44, he was promoted to, he was a wing commander by that time. And so he had kind of just finished being in combat. And in combat, he flew Mark 9s like this, and, fresh ones, combat ready. Visiting other bases, he got a squadron hack, and it was a Spitfire 5. And he went and had lunch and visited with, there was an American squadron on a base and some of his mates from combat, and he took off and made a pass and did a roll, and unfortunately he was a little low, and I don't know if it was because the airplane was tired or whatever, but he caught a wingtip, and that was pretty much it. Yeah. And he had such a remarkable life. There really ought to be a movie about him, except that the ending is kind of bad.
Yeah, Chuck was mentioning it in some of his research. Within 2 days of getting into Europe, he was already squiring an earl's daughter, and he ended up dating some showgirls and USO showgirls over in Egypt that were there entertaining, and there's some amazing stuff on the website and in the pictures.
He was quite a guy. When he the way he joined was a little different. It was interesting to listen to the vicar talk about Americans before 1940. Really, it wasn't legal for them to join the RCAF or RAF because America was officially neutral. And you have to think about 1940. 1940 was an election year, and so isolationism was kind of the public sentiment. Non-intervention, stay out of the war. And I think the people in power knew that wasn't going to happen, but that's what they campaigned on. And so in November of 40, the election was held and it was over. Late November 1940, FDR gave the Canadians permission, and they created a commission called the Clayton Knight Commission, and it was primarily Billy Bishop, the World War I leading Canadian ace, and this Clayton Knight, who was kind of the money. And they set up recruitment stations or offices in luxury hotels like the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and then some in Kansas City and one in San Francisco. And most accounts you'll hear about L.C. Wade will say that he went to Canada and joined the RAF, and he didn't. His family has been just wonderfully cooperative and provided all of his logbooks scanned to me, his diaries, postcards. Anyway, long story short, in his logbook on December 12th, he flew his little Welch airplane, which is really an unusual airplane.
With a 40 horsepower Continental.
Yeah, he had 9 hours in Aranca Chief, and then he had another maybe, I think he had 75 hours when he got done, and that was all in this Welch, which looks like an Aranca C3. And then he goes to San Francisco on the 18th, and he flies a 200 horse Waco for 5 hours, and I'm going, that just didn't make sense to me. Well, eventually, the historian of 33 Squadron, we made contact, and he provided his official RAF personnel record. And on the 18th of December, when he flew that Waco, that's his enlistment date. And then they flew him to Spartan College in Tulsa, where they were conducting what they called refresher courses. And it pretty much amounted to what we would call basic and advanced training, because they were flying the civilian equivalent of PT-19s and then T-6s and Spartan executives, of all things. Then he went to Canada. Then he went over, and as Warren said, he if you think about him, the words that come to my mind are dashing and debonair, because the man looks like
a rake.
Kind of. He wasn't a scoundrel or anything like that. He was a very honorable man, but he looked like Cary Grant. And if you look like Cary
More like
Grant,
Clark Gable.
or Clark Gable, Clark Gable. Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Because in 1940, if you look like Clark Gable, you're probably going to get a date.
Especially if you fly airplanes.
Yeah.
So he was as Warren said, he was squaring around a daughter of an earl by the time he was in England for a couple of days, and he went to their estate and all of that. And when he was in Egypt, he met these sisters, the Perhatch sisters, and they were showgirls and radio personalities who there's a picture of them when they had a command dancing for the king of Egypt.
For
And this mic is cutting out. He intended to marry one of the sisters, and of course, he died. And so anyway, his family, he had no kids because he died so young. His family's been really cooperative, and that's his niece or his nephew, and his niece by marriage. I can't say enough for her. Yeah. It always amazes me what they're willing to provide to somebody that they don't even know. Yeah. So we wanted to get them here, but they are watching, and I hope they enjoy the.
They made you an honorary family member here recently, didn't they?
Well, there's another interesting little tidbit about his name, L.C. Wade. L.C. was his name.
Yes.
And when he joined the RAF, they, put on the top of his card saying, this guy doesn't have a Christian name, and that was unacceptable for the bureaucracy and everything. So he had to come up with a name, and so he took the name of a cousin, Lance Cleo, and so that was the name he went by. And you've heard stories that years later, when somebody would call him Lance, he'd say, "Who's that?" Because that wasn't his name. His name was
That was
LC.
actually the family.
Yeah.
I contacted them, and there's books and articles out, and most of them call him Lance, and I finally found the family, and I emailed and said I'm interested in researching your relative Lance Wade, and that was the response. Who's that?
Who's
So
that?
they do not call him Lance, they call him LC, and so everything I write will be LC. And one thing I forgot, he was when he enlisted in San Francisco. The story is that he told them that his father flew with the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I, because the vicar made a really good point. A lot of the folks that enlisted in the RAF did so because the American Army Air Force required college, and he didn't have college, and that's why he was before we got into the war, but that's really his impetus. He would have been in the Army Air Force before that. So he told him that his father was in the Lafayette Escadrille, and I asked the family about that, and they said his father never got higher than the top wire of a barbed wire fence. But there was somebody with the last name of Wade in the Lafayette Escadrille. I looked at their roles, and it's just a different Wade. It's somebody else. So.
backing up a little bit, after he got out of Spartan and he went to Canada from there, right?
Yep.
Did he
Yes.
fly? Did he get transitioned in any airplane in Canada, or did he just go?
No, he went right to England, and then he has a lot of time in Miles Masters and then in the Hurricane.
So that he went from there to the Hurricane.
Yep.
So,
And then after training, he flew to a port, and they loaded up the Hurricanes on the Ark Royal carrier. So he actually, and they went to Malta. He actually took a Hurricane off a carrier.
Huh.
okay. Anything else you want to say about LC?
Not really. The nose art is pretty neat. He had a U.S. flag on his RAF airplane with a boxing rooster. You might notice that on your way by. But so he was an American in the RAF and fighting for the good guys.
Yeah.
We got time for some questions here. As a matter of fact, is that fellow right there, the two guys there, the blue, I see he's raising his hand. Cullen, you want to say something? This is my grandson, by the way.
I'd like to know, you talked about fabric on the Hurricane. Where is it fabric and where is it aluminum? And was there transition? You said wing versus fabric versus aluminum. When was the transition and what parts stayed fabric throughout?
Go ahead, Ray.
The early models had fabric on the wings. It wasn't for too long before they went with metal wings. It's the cockpit itself, they call it the doghouse, it's all wood, and it's covered with fabric. And everything after that, all of the tail section, horizontal, vertical, rudder, elevators, are all fabric. All of the belly panels are wooden structure covered with fabric, and they're all detachable, so you can get in. You can't do much. You can't get in, really, because of all the streamlined flying wires that are in there. And Warren raised this question with me. Why did they use streamlined flying wires? Well, because they had them. They were making them. The stuff was there. They didn't have to do anything else. They could just order the size and stamp them out or roll them out, and that was the way that was done. Does that answer the question?
No. Question here?
Easy question. When he flew from the Ark Royal to Malta, what squadron was he with?
He was still in the training squadron at that point. He hadn't been assigned a squadron, so they delivered the airplanes to Malta, and then he got on a short Sunderland. And at some point they decided what squadron he was assigned to, and taken to Egypt, and it was 3-3 squadron. Later with the Spitfire, it was 145.
Next question.
How often do you fly these? How many hours per year do you fly them? What maintenance do they require? And do you limit their Gs?
A lot.
Well, we don't put a lot of Gs on them. We probably max Gs that we put on the airplanes is 4, typically 3.5 during our display. We try to put 30 to 50 hours a year on the airplanes. Every 25 hours, they take the cam racks off and torque the heads, change oil, check screens and filters. And every year, or if we get 100 hours in a year, then we go through a condition inspection on the airplanes. What do you think, Bernie? You got anything to add to that? Yeah. Try to take care of them.
So the Spitfire's got the Merlin in it for a motor. How about the Hurricane? Is that the same engine or is that different power plant?
Well, originally, the Hurricane had the early Spitfires and the early Hurricanes had the same engines, right? Right? They all had -3s, or Merlin 3s, I guess they were called. We've converted these two airplanes to have the same engines in them, so we have commonality in the fleet. They're both 224s, which is very similar to what would be in a Mustang, except they're just single-stage superchargers. They're still 2-speed, but so we're getting a lot more horsepower than they would have originally had. Not this airplane. The Mark 9 had a bigger engine in it. But
yes, sir.
I'm just curious of the big strake on this side of the airplane behind the exhaust.
Great question.
Is there a story for that?
Yeah.
It's to keep the muzzle flash out of your eyes at night. It's to cover up the exhaust flame so that you can see at night.
And to keep your mustache from getting singed if you got the canopy open.
Critical.
Yes, sir.
Great presentation, by the way. But one important question that I have is Lance's importance in what he did here. And you mentioned showgirls. How come we don't have any showgirls? They were his motivation.
You should have been here a little earlier. We had one.
Yes, she did a very good job, right?
Yeah, she's great.
Just to add a little levity to your
We'll add that to the next presentation, right, Bruce?
You got it.
Over here, next.
Actually, while she's getting that mic, you're asking about how much these planes get flown. I think that's one thing, too, about Dakota Territory Air Museum is that these aren't hangar queens. We really make an effort to get these things out and bring them to air shows and veterans events and things like that, and really share them and tell the story of these planes. And so they get flown.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Would three different, shall we say, three equally rated pilots, so a German Messerschmitt pilot, a Hawker Brit pilot, and a Spitfire pilot, how would they fight each other? What were the strengths and advantages and disadvantages of these three aircraft?
I'd just win. The Hurricane, I think, will outturn the Spitfire. The Spitfire has probably got a little more vertical yo-yo stuff. If I was fighting the Hurricane with the Spitfire, I'd probably go vertical, and he'd probably try to turn inside me. I think that would be the difference. Although in a regular climb, the Hurricane outclimbs the Spitfire, so you'd have to have an altitude advantage in the beginning and use that energy to keep your speed up. This runs into a little bit more of a speed wall than that airplane does. As you dive it, it's a little more draggy. I've never had an opportunity to fly a German fighter. I don't know. I think the late model, the G109s and the 190s, were extremely capable airplanes. And the 109 with the slat system was a pretty good turning airplane. Terrible visibility. Big gun, a lot of range. The 109s had cannon, and I think that's why they went to cannon on this. So if you were a good shooter, you could take a long shot on it. I think this airplane's more of a get right up behind the guy and blow it out of the sky. And I think the climb rate and everything else on this airplane is why they primarily used them for bombers in the Battle of Britain. They would, I think they dispatched the Spitfires for the fighters as much as they could, and the Hurricanes for the bombers. Boy, dogfight, I think it's all so much personality and airplane. It's what a pilot's good at, and everything else. And then I just think there's an awful lot of situational awareness in the whole thing. The guys that could see good, that could gather up the battle plan, that could see what everybody else was doing, and enter into that stuff, and then fight that battle accordingly, was really what it was. And it is a great question, and it's a question that we all ask ourselves every day, and it'd be fun to go give it all the whirl without bullets. I don't want to do it with bullets.
But Warren, while we're on that subject of flying, how about landing the airplane in crosswinds?
It's a great airplane, and it's another great question. People look at the airplane, they see a narrow gear. Both these airplanes don't have steerable tail wheels, nor do they have locking tail wheels, which you would think in a big high horsepower tail wheel airplane would make them a little bit squirrely, but they've got such effective rudders, it's amazing how little speed you need in them. And the Spitfire, is there any glider pilots in the crowd? Because if you've glider, you got a center wheel and you can hold the wing down forever in a crosswind. You can do the same thing in this airplane. It's got, you land a Mustang or the Hurricane a little bit that way. When one wheel touches, the other one's coming down, and now you're dealing with that wing and stuff. Where the Spitfire, you can just kind of hold the wing down. So they're really pretty straightforward airplanes. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
When you fly these cross country to show, what altitude do you like to fly at, and what cruise speed? I know the fuel consumption's high.
Yeah. We came down at 9,500 feet with the two airplanes, and we were burning about 58 gallons an hour and doing about 205 knots true.
And the altitude really depends on who's flying that, because it's miserable on the inside hot.
Yeah.
So you go high.
Yeah, we were climbing to try to get him to where he was going to survive the hour-long trip.
Air conditioner doesn't work, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, well, we don't have them installed right now. But
they're in there.
There's two little air vents at the base of the windshield that stick up about this high. And when you're climbing, the air is coming through the wheel wells, and it feels great. You got all this air, and you think, man, that's pretty good. You roll the nose over, and all of a sudden it starts sucking air from the radiator up through the cockpit, and it literally, I would say, it's running 135 to 140 degrees in the cockpit, wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, something like. I mean, it's hot in there, and the air is going out those air vents instead of in them. So
yeah, if you reach up, the mic died. If you reach up and put your thumb in the air vent, it actually gets cooler because it stops sucking the hot air from the radiator up.
So I was about halfway home from Ray's shop, and I went over to a buddy of mine's place in Pierre, South Dakota. We were getting gas, and they make these little blue Phillips 66 oil nozzles that come with a quart of oil. Took my jackknife and cut the threads off and stuffed one on each side and put horns out there, and they work perfect. Then you had air. So if you see pictures of this airplane sometime and you go, what are them funny blue things? That's what they are.
It is.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. This is fantastic. We really want to watch these power up and taxi off. When is the next scheduled time when you'll be doing that, and where will they be?
We're scheduled to fly in the air show tomorrow and Saturday with the airplanes, and most likely because of the crowds, they'll get pushed back or towed back to the tie downs today. We hadn't really arranged for anything to start them today, but we'll be flying in the show tomorrow. We're opening the World War II segment of it. I would guess it'll be around 2 o'clock. Yeah. Yep.
Yes, sir. Wait just a minute. Let me get you a mic. This will be our last question. I want to thank you folks for coming today.
Any cockpit heat in the wintertime for the pilots?
Don't need any in the hurricane.
Yeah, they did have heat available in the airplanes. Most of what those guys dealt with was clothing, because they were changing altitude so much and stuff. But they got dressed extremely warm when they went to altitude in the Spitfire. You see the pictures. The reenactors are out here, but they are multiple layers of clothing and stuff, which I can't hardly imagine getting in the airplane with all that on because.
And most of the airplanes had provisions for hot suits.
Yeah, electric.
So they would put on their wool-lined clothes, and when they got to altitude, they'd turn them on. And I imagine when they were fighting, they went right to off.
Yeah, sweaty.
By the way, we want to thank David Hartman for our video. Unfortunately, he's not here this year, but he did a lot of work for that, and we want to thank him for that. Do we have veterans in the audience here? For all our veterans, stand up. Raise your hand. I want to thank everybody. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Bruce, Warren, our group over here, we want to thank you guys for your time and bringing the airplanes here. You just can't say how much we appreciate it.
And thank you for your interest.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you much.